When I think back to that night, I still feel the sting on my cheek like it just happened yesterday. It was one of those cold evenings in November when the wind cuts through your coat, no matter how thick it is. I was standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of chicken soup, the same soup I had made for my son since he was little. It used to be his favorite meal, the one that made him smile after a long day, but that night was different. That night something in him broke, or maybe it had been breaking for a long time and I just didn't see it. I remember calling him to the table. "Michael, dinner's ready," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He walked in slowly, his eyes tired, his face drawn. He had been stressed for weeks ever since he lost his job. He barely spoke anymore. He just sat there with his phone in one hand and anger in the other. I placed the bowl of soup in front of him and smiled. "You'll feel better after this, sweetheart?" I said. He took one bite and then suddenly slammed the spoon down. The sound echoed through the room. He glared at me and said bitterly, "There's no salt in this, Mom. What's wrong with you?" I blinked, confused and a little scared. "Oh, I'm sorry, honey," I said softly. "I must have forgotten. I'll get the salt shaker." But before I could move, he stood up and yelled, "You can't even cook right anymore. What do you even do all day?" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked up at him and said quietly, "Michael, please calm down. It's just soup." But then it happened. He raised his hand and hit me across the face. The sound was small, but the pain was deep. My body went cold. My mind went blank. For a moment, I couldn't even process what had just happened. My own son, the boy I raised, the boy I carried for 9 months, had just hit me because the soup had no salt. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there feeling like the world had stopped spinning. He must have realized what he did because his expression changed. He looked shocked, then ashamed. But instead of saying sorry, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. I stood there alone in the kitchen, staring at the bowl of soup still steaming on the table. The spoon had fallen out, and there was a little splash of broth on the tablecloth. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a wound that would never heal. I sat down and covered my face with my hands. The tears came, then hot and uncontrollable. I wasn't crying just because he hit me. I was crying because I didn't recognize him anymore. The sweet boy who used to run into my arms after school, the boy who used to whisper, "I love you, Mom," before bed was gone, replaced by someone I didn't understand. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker. My mind kept going back to every moment we shared, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories. I wondered where I went wrong. I had raised him alone after his father died in an accident when Michael was only 7. I worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. I missed meals. I missed sleep. I missed everything except my duty as his mother. And now it felt like none of that mattered. The next morning he came back home. I heard the door open and I tensed up. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at the floor. I wanted to hear him say sorry, but the words never came. Instead, he mumbled, "I'm going out for a while," and left again. I stood there watching him walk away, and I knew something inside me had changed. That was the moment I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I wasn't going to be the kind of woman who silently takes pain just because it came from family love. Wasn't supposed to hurt like that. It wasn't supposed to make you feel small. I didn't know what to do or where to go, but I knew I needed to find my strength again. The next day, I went to the church down the street. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Thompson, saw me sitting in the back pew and came over. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just took my hand and said softly, "You look like a woman who's been carrying too much." I couldn't stop crying. I told her everything, the soup, the anger, the slap. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said one thing that stayed with me forever. Sometimes the people we love the most forget who we are. But that doesn't mean we have to forget ourselves. She helped me join a small group of women who met every week to talk and support each other. Most of them had gone through similar pain. Some were mothers like me, some were wives, some were daughters. We shared stories, cried together, prayed together, and little by little I started to heal. I began working part-time at a local diner washing dishes. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose again. The owner, Mr. Hayes, was kind. He would always say, "You've got a strong heart, Martha. Don't let anyone dim your light." Hearing those words made me feel seen. Michael barely called during those months. I missed him terribly, but I also knew he needed space, maybe even help. I kept hoping he would find his way back, not just home, but to the person he used to be. Every night before bed, I whispered a prayer for him. I said, "Lord, please guide my boy back to kindness, back to love." One afternoon, while cleaning tables at the diner, I saw something that made my heart stop. Michael walked in. He looked thinner, older. Somehow he had dark circles under his eyes. He saw me and froze. Then slowly he walked over Mom. He said, his voice trembling, "Can we talk?" I wiped my hands on my apron and nodded. We sat at a corner booth, and for a while he couldn't look me in the eyes. He finally said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've been angry at everything, at life, at myself, but I took it out on you. I'm sorry, Mom, so sorry." Tears filled my eyes. I wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. I just reached out and held his hand. That simple touch said everything. I forgave him. Not because it was easy, but because holding on to pain would only keep both of us trapped. That day was the start of something new, something fragile but real. We both began to heal slowly. The weeks after that conversation with Michael felt quiet in a different way. Not like loneliness, but like peace, slowly coming back into my home. I still woke up early every morning to make breakfast for one, but I did it with gratitude. Instead of sadness, sometimes I would pour an extra cup of coffee and leave it across the table like a small prayer for my son, wherever he was. I had learned that healing doesn't happen in one big moment. It comes in small steps, small breaths, small choices every day. The first real step was when Mrs. Thompson asked me to help at the church kitchen during their weekend lunches for the homeless. At first I thought I had nothing left to give, but when I started serving soup to those who had even less than I did, something inside me opened up again. There was an older man who came every Saturday. He would always thank me and say, "You make this with love, don't you?" It made me smile because for the first time in a long while I felt seen for something good, not for my pain or my mistakes, but for my heart. That small thing gave me courage to keep showing up every week. One afternoon after the lunch was over, I sat outside the church steps looking at the sunset. The sky was painted with soft pinks and golds. I thought about Michael again, wondering how he was doing. My phone buzzed. It was a message from him. He said, "Mom, I found a job at a small garage. I'm trying to do better. I love you." I held the phone to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, God." Slowly, he started visiting on Sundays. He would bring groceries, sometimes flowers, sometimes just his smile. The first time he hugged me again. After so many months, I felt like the heavy weight that had been pressing on my chest finally lifted. He said, "Mom, I'm still working on myself, but I promise I'll never raise my hand to you or anyone again." It wasn't easy to trust those words. At first, I would still flinch when he got upset or raised his voice a little too quickly, but he ever hurt me again. I saw how hard he was trying. There were days when he came home exhausted from work, yet he still helped me with chores. He even came with me to the diner one day and fixed the squeaky kitchen door just like his father used to. But the world around us wasn't always kind. Some neighbors had seen him shouting that night months ago, and gossip spread faster than truth. They would whisper behind my back in the grocery store, "Poor Martha, her son turned violent." I could hear the pity in their voices, but I refused to let it define me. One afternoon I smiled at one of them and said quietly, "People make mistakes, but God doesn't stop loving them. Neither will I." That silence afterward was louder than any gossip. One Sunday after church, Mr. Hayes, the diner owner, called me into his office. He said, "Martha, I've been watching how you treat people with so much patience and care. You remind me of my late wife. She had the same gentle spirit. Would you consider being the new floor supervisor?" I was stunned. I had never been given a position like that before. I said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure I'm ready for that responsibility." He smiled and said, "You're more than ready. You've got wisdom in your eyes. You know what kindness looks like, and that's what this place needs more of." That promotion changed a lot for me. It wasn't just about a bigger paycheck, it was about dignity. It was about proving to myself that I could rebuild from ashes. Without the bitterness, I started wearing bright scarves again. The ones Michael used to tease me about when he was little. I even laughed more freely than I had in years. Michael noticed too. He said, "Mom, you look happier these days." I told him I am son because I finally remembered who I am. But life has a way of testing us just when we think we've found balance. One night Michael came home late. He looked shaken. I asked what happened. He said quietly, "Mom, I was at a bar after work. One of the guys was talking bad about you. He called you a burden. He said, you probably drove your husband away. I lost control and hit him. My heart sank. I said, Michael, violence never solves pain. He sat down and buried his face in his hands. I know, Mom, I know. I just got so angry. I walked over and placed my hand on his shoulder. I said, you can't heal anger with more anger. You have to forgive them, even when they don't deserve it, because forgiveness is what keeps your heart free. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, how do you do it, Mom? How do you forgive everyone and still stay kind? I smiled sadly and said, because once you see how darkness feels, you never want to live there again. That night I prayed harder than ever. I prayed that my son would learn peace the way I had learned it, the hard way, not through fear, but through grace. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The man Michael hit came to our house. I was terrified, thinking he came to start trouble, but he took off his hat and said, Mrs. Carter, your son apologized to me at work. He even offered to pay for the damages. I just wanted you to know I forgive him. I've seen how hard he works. He's a good kid who just needed a second chance. I almost cried. I thanked him and shook his hand after he left. Michael hugged me tighter than ever and said, Mom, it's over. I'm really trying to be better. I said, I know, son. I know and I believe you. From that day on, things started to change for good. He stayed sober. He worked extra hours. He even helped fix the church roof one week, and people started seeing the change in him, not just hearing about it. He was softer with everyone, especially me. Sometimes when I sat by the window at night and saw the lights from his car pulling into the driveway, I felt a warmth in my heart. I realized that sometimes the hardest pain can become the greatest lesson if we let love lead the way. It had been almost a year since that terrible night with the soup and the slap, and life finally felt calm again every day. I woke up grateful that my home was peaceful, my heart was healing, and my son was learning how to be gentle again. But peace never lasts forever, and sometimes life tests you just when you start to breathe again. It was a bright Monday morning, and I was at the diner early, making coffee and setting tables. The smell of bacon filled the air. The regulars were laughing and talking about football. It felt like an ordinary day until the phone rang. I answered and heard Mr. Hayes' voice shaking, Martha, we need you out front now. I rushed through the swinging door and saw one of the cooks lying on the floor, clutching his chest. People were shouting, call 911, call 911. I dropped to my knees beside him, his face pale and his breathing shallow. In that moment, something inside me took over. I remembered all the first aid classes I had taken years ago when Michael was little. I started chest compressions, counting out loud, trying to stay calm. Someone handed me a damp towel, and I kept pressing until the ambulance arrived. They took him away, and I sat there shaking my hands, trembling, covered in sweat and tears. Later that night, Mr. Hayes called to say the cook was stable. He said, Martha, you saved his life. I cried quietly, holding the phone to my ear. He said, you always said you weren't brave, but look what you did. You were calm when everyone else panicked. You were light in the middle of chaos. Those words stayed with me. The next Sunday at church, Pastor Thompson told everyone what happened, and people clapped for me. I didn't know what to do. I just smiled and said, God used my hands when they were needed. But deep down, I realized something powerful. I wasn't the broken woman who had been hit and silenced anymore. I was someone who could stand strong when others fell apart. A few weeks later, Michael came home with good news, Mom. I got a promotion at work, he said, beaming. I hugged him tight and whispered, I'm proud of you. He said, I couldn't have done it without you. You kept believing in me when no one else did. That night, We cooked dinner together. He was stirring the soup, this time laughing, saying, "I made sure to add salt, Mom. I promise I'll never forget again." We both laughed until tears came. It felt like the first time in years that laughter filled the house. But even joy can carry shadows. A month later, Mr. Hayes had a stroke and the diner closed for a while. I suddenly found myself without work again. Bills started piling up. The quiet in the house turned heavy. I tried to stay strong for Michael, but inside I was scared. One evening, as I sat by the window, Michael came and sat beside me. He said, "Mom, I know things are tough, but I can help now. I've got savings. I want to take care of you for a change." I shook my head, saying, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "Yes, I do. You taught me how to get back up, and now it's my turn to help you." He found me a small job at his company's cafeteria washing dishes again. It wasn't easy work, but I was surrounded by kind people. I even made friends with a woman named Nancy who reminded me of myself. She was raising her granddaughter after losing her daughter in an accident. We used to talk during breaks and share stories about our families. One day Nancy said, "Martha, I don't know how you stay so patient. You smile even when life throws storms at you." I told her I used to think strength meant fighting back. Now I know it means staying kind even when the world isn't. She nodded and said, "Maybe that's why people feel safe around you." But the real test came a few weeks later. There was a rumor going around at the cafeteria that I had only gotten the job because of Michael. Someone said I was using my son's name to get special treatment. I overheard it when I was cleaning tables. The words hurt more than I expected. That night I came home quiet. Michael noticed right away. He said, "Mom, what's wrong?" I told him, and he got angry. He said, "Who said that? I'll set them straight." I held his hand and said, "No, son. Don't fight this for me. I'll handle it myself." The next day I walked into the cafeteria and found the woman who had started the rumor. She looked nervous. I smiled gently and said, "I heard what you said about me, and I just wanted to tell you something. I'm proud of my son. And yes, he helped me find this job. But every dish I wash, every table I clean, I do with my own hands and my own heart. I've worked hard all my life, and I'll keep doing that. I'm not ashamed of getting help when it comes from love." She looked at me with wide eyes and then whispered, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." After that, people treated me differently. They respected me more, not because I shouted, but because I stood tall without anger. That night I told Michael what happened, and he hugged me saying, "Mom, you handled that better than anyone could have." I said, "Maybe I'm just tired of letting pain speak louder than peace." He smiled and said, "You're the strongest person I know." Months passed and life settled again. The diner reopened and Mr. Hayes rehired me as a manager. He said, "Martha, I can't think of anyone who deserves this more. You care about people in a way that makes them want to be better." I thanked him with tears in my eyes. By that time, Michael was saving money to buy his own small house. He said, "Mom, when I get that place, you'll have a room there too." I laughed and said, "I'll think about it." He said, "No, you have to be there. I don't want to live without you close." And in that laughter and love, I realized something deeper. The woman who once sat crying by the window, broken and ashamed, had become someone people looked up to. Not because her life was easy, but because she never stopped choosing kindness. It was a quiet Friday morning when I woke up early and brewed coffee for Michael. The air felt colder than usual, and for some reason I had a strange heaviness in my chest, like the world was trying to whisper something. I couldn't yet hear. Michael had left early for work. He was supposed to call me at lunchtime, like he always did, but that call never came. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was busy, maybe his phone battery had died, but when the sky started turning orange and the clock struck 7 and still no call, I felt something deep inside me twist. I knew something wasn't right. I tried calling his number again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt my hands trembling as I whispered, "Please God, just let him be okay." An hour later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I saw 2 police officers standing there, their hats in their hands. My heart sank before they even spoke. The taller one said, "Softly, Mrs. Carter, there's been an accident. Your son Michael was involved in a collision on Route 19. He paused for a long moment. I could barely breathe. He said he didn't make it. I don't remember falling, but I remember the sound of the coffee cup hitting the floor, shattering into pieces, and the officer's voice fading away. The next thing I knew, I was on my knees sobbing, the world spinning around me. The pain was something words could never describe. It felt like the ground itself had given way under my feet. The next few days passed in a blur, the funeral, the condolences, the endless stream of faces and flowers. None of it felt real. I kept expecting him to walk through the door to say, "Mom, I'm home," and laugh like he always did, but he never did. The house felt empty, like it had lost its heartbeat. People kept telling me to be strong, but I didn't know how my son was gone. And so was the laughter, the noise, the warmth that filled this home for so long. Every corner of the house reminded me of him, his shoes by the door, his jacket on the chair, the photo of us on the mantel where he was hugging me with that big goofy smile. I touched that picture every morning, whispering, "I love you, baby," until my voice would break. One evening, Mrs. Thompson came over. She brought soup and sat quietly beside me. She didn't say much for a long time. Then she said, "Martha, when my brother died, I felt like I couldn't breathe for weeks, but then I realized that love doesn't die. It just changes the way it lives inside us. He's still with you, honey, just in a different way now." That night I sat by the window again looking at the stars, and I whispered, "Michael, if you can hear me, please let me know you're okay. I'll keep living. I promise I'll keep going because you'd want me to." The next morning I woke up to find a small envelope under my front door. It had my name written on it in handwriting that looked familiar but shaky. I opened it, and inside was a small folded paper. It said, "Mom, I wrote this a few weeks ago at work, just in case something ever happened to me. I want you to know you were the best thing in my life. I'm sorry for all the pain I caused. You taught me what forgiveness means. And because of you, I became a better man. I love you always, Michael." I held that letter to my chest and sobbed until I couldn't cry anymore. It was as if God had sent me one final message through him. The pain didn't disappear, but that letter became my strength. I framed it and placed it by my bed, so every morning when I woke up, I could read it and remember that love doesn't end. Weeks passed and people slowly stopped calling. Life moved on for everyone else, but not for me. I struggled to find purpose again until one afternoon, Mr. Hayes came by the house. He said, "Martha, we've all been worried about you. Everyone at the diner misses your smile. Why don't you come back? You don't have to rush. Just come sit with us sometimes." At first I didn't want to go back. It felt wrong to laugh or work when my son was gone. But then I remembered what Michael wrote, "I love you, Mom, keep living," so I went back. When I walked into the diner, everyone stopped and hugged me. One of the waitresses whispered, "We are so glad you're here, Miss Martha." I smiled weakly and said, "I'm trying, sweetheart, I'm trying." Slowly, I began helping again. I washed dishes, wiped tables, poured coffee, and listened to people's stories. The work was simple, but it filled the silence inside me with purpose. People started coming to me for advice, not just about work, but about life. A young waitress named Jenna told me she was having trouble with her mother and didn't know how to forgive her. I looked at her and said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean what they did was okay. It just means you're not letting their pain control your peace." As the weeks went on, I realized that helping others was helping me too. It didn't erase my grief, but it gave it meaning. Every act of kindness I gave away felt like a small prayer for Michael, like he was watching and smiling, saying, "That's my mom." One day, a man came into the diner with a little boy. The boy looked just like Michael when he was young. Same curly hair, same curious eyes. The man said, "Can we sit here, miss?" And I nodded. My heart ached watching them laugh together, but it also warmed me because it reminded me that love still existed, even if it wasn't mine to hold anymore. Later that evening, when I walked home, I looked at the sunset and whispered, "Thank you, God, for letting me love someone so much that losing him hurts this deeply, because that love means my life was full." That night I sat down and wrote a letter to Michael. I told him about the diner, about the people I helped, about how his letter gave me strength. I ended it with, I will keep living, son. I promise I'll keep making this world a little kinder, one day at a time. Just like you taught me to. Spring came quietly that year. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of green grass and tiny wildflowers along the edges of the street. I would watch them every morning from my window, thinking how they still bloomed even after months of cold and darkness. Maybe that was what healing looked like, not the sudden disappearance of pain, but small signs of life returning. One Sunday after church, I stayed behind while everyone left. I walked to the little garden behind the chapel where I used to sit with Michael when he was young. We would feed the birds and laugh at how greedy they were. I sat on that same bench alone this time and whispered, "Michael, I wish you could see how the world is still beautiful." Pastor Thompson came out quietly and sighed, "Martha, we're starting a small community kitchen next month to help feed struggling families. Would you like to be part of it?" I looked up at him surprised and said, "Me." He smiled and said, "Of course you've got a gift for making people feel cared for." That night I thought about it for hours. I wasn't sure if I was ready to take on anything new. My heart still felt fragile. But then I looked at Michael's framed letter by my bed and read the words again. "You taught me what forgiveness means, and because of you, I became a better man. I love you always, Mom." That was my answer. I decided to do it for him. The next week, I joined the small team of volunteers. It was just a few of us at first, Mrs. Thompson, 2 teenagers from the church, and me. We cooked in the church basement on old stoves with pots that rattled and handles that squeaked, but the food came out warm and full of love. At first, only a few people came: a single mother with her kids, a tired old man who walked with a cane, a young girl who looked too thin for her age. But then word spread, and soon every Sunday we had a full room. The laughter, the smell of food, the sound of children's chatter filled that old space with life again. I found myself smiling more each day. One afternoon, while serving soup, a little boy tugged at my apron and said, "Miss Martha, this tastes like home." I felt my heart melt. I leaned down and said, "That's because it's made with love, sweetheart. Just like my son used to like it." He smiled and ran back to his seat. That night I went home and sat at the kitchen table with my journal. I wrote down everything I felt. I wrote about the faces I saw, the stories they told, the gratitude in their eyes. I realized that every bowl of soup I served was a piece of my healing. It was Michael's favorite meal too. It felt like a circle had closed, not in sorrow, but in love. Weeks turned into months, and the community kitchen became something bigger. The town newspaper wrote a small article about us saying a mother's love feeds a whole town. They asked to interview me, but I said I'm just one part of it. God did the rest. Mr. Hayes from the diner came by one day with a box of supplies. He said, "You're making a difference, Martha. You're turning pain into hope." I hugged him and said, "I'm just trying to share what I was given, kindness." Sometimes people would stay after the meals just to talk. Many were lonely or lost in their own struggles. I would listen and tell them what Mrs. Thompson once told me. Love doesn't die. It just changes the way it lives inside us. And somehow those words helped others the same way they had once helped me. But one evening as we were cleaning up, Mrs. Thompson collapsed suddenly, her body shaking. I screamed for help. We called an ambulance and they rushed her to the hospital. The doctor said she had a heart condition. I sat by her bedside for days, holding her hand, whispering prayers. She woke up weak but smiling. She said, "Martha, don't you dare stop this kitchen, promise me." I nodded with tears in my eyes. She squeezed my hand and said, "You have the heart for this. God chose you for a reason." When she finally came home from the hospital, she told me she wanted to step down from organizing and asked me to take her place. I was shocked. I said, "Oh no, I'm not a leader." She smiled and said, "Yes, you are. You lead every time you choose kindness." So I did. I took over organizing the kitchen. It wasn't easy at first. I had to manage supplies, arrange volunteers, handle donations, but every time I felt unsure, I'd whisper, "Michael, help your mama," and somehow everything would work out. Soon people from other towns started coming too, bringing food, clothes, even money to help. The church basement couldn't hold everyone anymore. So we moved to a bigger space downtown, and we named it Michael's Table. When I saw that sign go up for the first time, I cried Quietly, I thought about the boy who once lost his way, the young man who had found forgiveness, and the mother who had found purpose in the ashes. Every time I stirred a pot of soup, I felt like I was talking to him, like he was there, smiling, saying, "You did it, Mom." One evening, a woman came to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "Miss Martha, I used to come here when I was broke and hopeless because of this place. I got back on my feet, I found a job, and I brought you this envelope. Inside was a small donation and a note that said, 'Thank you for feeding my body and my soul.'" That night, I went home, lit a candle, and whispered, "Michael, we're helping people just like you wanted. We're keeping love alive." It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was cream-colored with my name written neatly in blue ink. For a moment, I thought it might be from an old friend, but when I opened it, I saw the logo of a local community organization. It was an invitation. They were hosting an event for women who had made a difference in their towns, and they wanted me to come and share my story. My first instinct was to say no. I was just an ordinary woman. I had no speeches or fancy degrees. I simply cooked soup and listened to broken hearts. But then I remembered Mrs. Thompson's words, "You lead every time you choose kindness." So I decided to go. The evening of the event, I wore a simple blue dress and a pearl necklace that Michael had given me years ago. I sat in the back as the room filled with people. Some women talked about starting businesses, others about raising awareness for causes. When my turn came, I felt my hands shake. I walked up to the stage, my heart beating so loud I could almost hear it. I took a deep breath and said softly, "I'm not sure I belong here, but if my story helps even one person, I'm grateful." I told them about the night my son hit me, about the darkness that followed, about the people who helped me stand up again, and about the kitchen we built together called Michael's Table. The room went completely quiet. I could see tears in some eyes when I finished. I said, "Sometimes pain becomes the seed of purpose. You just have to water it with love." The audience stood and clapped. I was stunned. People came up after to hug me, to thank me, to share their own stories of pain and hope. One woman whispered in my ear, "My son and I haven't spoken in years. You made me want to call him again." That moment felt like a light had entered the room. From that day on, things changed. People from all over started reaching out. Some wanted to volunteer. Others wanted to donate. I received letters from mothers, from men who had lost their way, from young people who just needed hope. The local news station even came to do a story. They filmed the kitchen, the volunteers, and the long line of people who came for a meal. I was nervous being on camera, but when the reporter asked me what keeps me going, I smiled and said, "Love, love keeps me going every single day." After that, the kitchen grew bigger. We started offering job training, small classes on cooking and budgeting, and even counseling for families. We weren't just feeding people anymore. We were helping them rebuild their lives. Sometimes I would look around and think, how did I get here? How did a broken heart become a place of healing? And then I'd remember that kindness has its own mysterious way of multiplying. One afternoon, a familiar car stopped outside the kitchen. I looked up and my breath caught. It was Jacob, my son. He stepped out slowly, looking nervous. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. My hands trembled, but I walked toward him. He said softly, "Hi, Mom, I saw the news. I wanted to see it for myself." I swallowed hard and nodded, "Come inside." I said. He looked around the kitchen, the people laughing, the smell of soup filling the air. He whispered, "You did all this?" I said, "We did. Michael helped too." He looked down, then met my eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything, for the way I treated you, for letting anger control me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to try again." Tears filled my eyes. I took his hand and said, "Son, forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we share when love still lives inside us, and I never stopped loving you." He broke down right there in the kitchen. I held him just like I did when he was little, and for the first time in years I felt peace so deep I could hardly breathe. From that day, Jacob started helping at the kitchen. He fixed shelves, lifted boxes, and sometimes even cooked, though he wasn't very good at it. He said it made him feel close to Michael and to me. People noticed how gentle he became. He smiled more. He talked to others about his mistakes and how he was learning to change. He told young men at the shelter, "It's never too late to start being kind." Every evening after everyone left, we would sit together on the front steps watching the sunset. He would say, "Mom, I can't believe how far you've come." And I would laugh and say, "Me neither, son. But maybe it's not how far I've come, but how much love I carried along the way." The kitchen became more than a place. It became a heartbeat in the town, a reminder that hope can be cooked and served warm to anyone who needs it. Years later, when people ask me what I learned from all this, I'd say something simple, that even when life breaks you, if you keep choosing kindness, one day you'll look around and realize you've built something beautiful from the pieces. A few months after Jacob returned home, life began to feel calm again. The kitchen was running smoothly, volunteers were full of laughter, and the people we served were starting to find jobs and homes. It was as if hope had become contagious, spreading quietly through every person who walked through our door. One morning I was making coffee when the phone rang. A gentle voice introduced herself as a producer from a national television show. She said they had heard about our story, the mother who built a kitchen after losing everything and finding peace again. She said they wanted to feature us in a segment about everyday heroes. I almost laughed out loud. I told her I wasn't a hero. I was just a woman who tried to feed people when life hurt too much. She said softly, "Maybe that is exactly what a hero is, Mrs. Turner." The following week, they arrived with cameras and microphones. Jacob stood beside me, helping the crew while I tried not to feel nervous. They filmed the kitchen, the smiling volunteers, the old wooden tables, and the families eating together. They asked me questions about forgiveness, about love, and about what kept me going. When the interview ended, the producer said, "I think the world needs to hear your story now more than ever." That evening when the show aired, the phone didn't stop ringing. Messages poured in from all over the country. People said the story made them cry, made them call their parents, made them remember kindness again. Donations began to arrive, but more than that, letters came in envelopes with shaky handwriting. Some said they had left abusive homes. Some said they were learning to forgive someone they love. Some just said, "Thank you for reminding me to believe again." Jacob watched me read each letter, his eyes shining with pride. He said quietly, "Mom, Michael would be proud of you." I smiled and said, "Maybe he's watching us right now, stirring soup in heaven and shaking his head at how much salt I use." We both laughed, and for the first time in years, laughter didn't hurt anymore. Weeks passed, and one afternoon, a man in a dark suit came to the kitchen. He introduced himself as a representative from the mayor's office. He said the city wanted to honor me for community service. I was speechless. Me honored by the mayor. I didn't know what to say. The ceremony was small but beautiful. They gave me a framed certificate and flowers. People clapped, and someone in the back shouted, "We love you, Martha." I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. Jacob stood next to me, holding back tears. When it was over, I said something simple on the microphone, "Thank you, but I don't do this for awards. I do it because I know what it feels like to be hungry, not just for food, but for love and for a place to belong." That night when I went home, I sat in my rocking chair and looked at Michael's picture on the wall. The light from the lamp made it glow softly. I whispered, "You see, my boy, you were right all along. Love is the only recipe that never fails." A few months later, I received another call, this time from a national foundation. They wanted to give a grant to expand the kitchen and open a second one in another town. I felt my heart skip a beat. We were really going to grow. We traveled to the next town to look for a place to start. Jacob drove, and I looked out the window, watching the rolling fields and the small houses passing by. He said quietly, "Mom, I'm proud of you. You turned pain into purpose." I looked at him and said, "Son, we did this together." Love doesn't grow in one heart alone. It grows when two broken hearts decide to heal together. When the second kitchen opened, it felt like déjà vu, the same smell of soup, the same laughter, the same warmth spreading across strangers who had become family. Months later, we had both kitchens running. Strong people from other states started calling, asking for guidance on how to start their own versions. I couldn't believe it. The little spark we lit had become a fire of kindness, spreading far beyond what I had dreamed. One evening when the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat with Jacob outside the first kitchen. The sky was painted in gold and pink, and the air was soft with the scent of bread baking. I said, quietly, "You know, son, when you hit me that day over the soup, I thought my world had ended, but maybe it was only beginning." Jacob nodded, tears shining in his eyes. He said, "Mom, that day broke me too, and everything since then has been about learning how to make it right. You taught me that love can rebuild anything." I reached over and held his hand. I said, "No, son. Love didn't just rebuild us. It built a home for hundreds of souls who just needed one warm meal and one gentle word." As the stars came out that night, I looked up and smiled, whispering, "Thank you, God, for not letting bitterness win." From that day forward, I began to write down everything that had happened, not because I wanted fame, but because I didn't want anyone else to feel alone. I wrote about Michael, about Jacob, about the kitchen, about forgiveness, and about how sometimes pain becomes the very soil where love grows strongest. Those writings would later turn into something I never expected, but that's another part of the story that came next after the second kitchen opened. Life moved faster than I ever imagined. My days were full of faces and stories, people who came to eat, people who came to help, and people who came just to talk. The little town that once felt heavy with loneliness was now full of laughter and light. The sound of pots clanging and children playing had become music to my soul. One evening while cleaning up, I received a letter with a golden seal. It was from a publishing house in New York. The editor had somehow read a few of the journal pages I had sent to a local magazine. She wrote, saying she had never cried so much reading about love and loss and healing. She wanted to publish my story as a book. At first I said, "No, I was just an old woman who cooked soup." But Jacob said, "Mom, maybe this book can feed hearts the same way your kitchen feeds people." So I prayed about it and finally said yes. For months I wrote every night after the kitchens closed. Sometimes I wrote with tears falling onto the paper. Sometimes I smiled, remembering small miracles that had carried me this far. When the book was finished, the editor called it "A Taste of Hope." When it was released, I didn't expect much, but somehow people found it. They read it in small towns and big cities. I started receiving letters from people saying the story changed how they treated their families or helped them believe in forgiveness again. Some said they started cooking meals for strangers because of it. Others said they finally forgave someone who had hurt them years ago. One day, Jacob showed me an article online. It said "The Taste of Hope" had become a national bestseller. I say, down slowly, tears running down my cheeks. I whispered, "Thank you, God, not for the fame, but for letting kindness travel farther than I ever could." Not long after that, I was invited to a conference in Chicago. They wanted me to speak about community healing. I was terrified of flying, but Jacob held my hand the whole way. When I stood on that stage looking at hundreds of faces, I remembered the first time I had ever spoken in front of people at that tiny local event. I smiled and said softly, "I used to think I was too broken to matter, but God can take a shattered heart and make it a window for light to shine through." People stood and clapped and cried after the talk. A young woman approached me. She said, "I read your book when I was in a shelter. It made me believe that maybe my story wasn't over yet." She hugged me and whispered, "You saved my life." That hug felt like heaven touching earth. The kitchens kept growing. We opened a third one and then a fourth. The community had become a movement. People started calling it the Turner Tables in honor of Michael and our family. It was never about me. It was about love passing from one hand to another. Years later, when I turned 70, the town threw me a surprise celebration. I walked into the hall and saw banners with pictures of smiling faces, children and families who had found warmth through the kitchens. Everyone shouted surprise, and my heart almost burst with joy. Jacob came forward holding a small box. He said, "Mom, open it." Inside was a golden locket shaped like a heart engraved with 3 words, "Love never ends." I opened it and saw 2 tiny photos inside, one of Michael and one of me. The other side was left empty for Jacob to add his someday. Tears filled my eyes. I hugged him tightly and said, "Thank you, son, not for the locket, but for coming home that day. You could have stayed gone, but you came back, and that changed everything." He whispered, "I came home because you never stopped loving me, even when I didn't deserve it." That night after the party, I sat outside under the stars holding the locket. The sky was wide and peaceful. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. I thought about the day years ago when everything had fallen apart because a bowl of soup had no salt. How strange it was that the same soup had led to hundreds of thousands of full hearts. It made me realize that sometimes pain is just love asking for a new direction. It breaks us only to open space for something more beautiful to grow. Months passed and life felt gentle again, until one afternoon while walking to the kitchen, I felt dizzy, the world tilted and went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed with machines softly beeping beside me. Jacob was sitting there, his face pale with worry. He held my hand and said quietly, "Mom, you scared me. The doctor says it was your heart, but you'll be okay if you rest." I smiled weakly and said, "I guess even hearts that love too much need a break." Sometimes he laughed through tears and kissed my forehead. During those quiet days in the hospital, I had time to think about everything, the mistakes, the miracles, the forgiveness, the second chances, and I realized that the greatest gift life ever gave me wasn't the kitchens or the wards or even the book. It was the chance to love and be loved again. When I finally returned home, people had decorated the kitchen with flowers and signs that said, "Welcome back, Martha." I looked around and felt overwhelmed with love. As I stood by the door, Jacob whispered in my ear, "Mom, I know you've given everything to this place, but maybe now it's time to rest a little. Let me take over for a while." I smiled at him with pride and said, "You already have, son. You already have." That night, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, stirring a small pot of soup just like I used to in the beginning. I tasted it, smiled, and whispered softly, "Perfect, not too much salt, just enough love." The seasons changed once more. The leaves turned golden, the air grew cooler, and the streets filled with the smell of autumn pies, tea. The world outside seemed calm, but inside my heart I could feel time moving differently, slower, softer, like an old song fading but still sweet. I had lived through storms that once broke me, but now every sunrise felt like a gift. One Sunday morning I woke before dawn and sat by the window. The house was quiet. I could hear the wind brushing through the trees and the faint hum of life waking up. I thought about Michael and Jacob and all the people who had come through our kitchen, each one leaving a piece of their heart behind. The doctor had told me my heart was weaker now and I needed to rest more, but I didn't feel afraid. I had already seen how love could outlive pain and how kindness could outlast sorrow. I had seen miracles in bowls of soup and forgiveness in the eyes of a son who once lost his way. That morning, Jacob came in carrying coffee. He smiled and said, "Mom, do you ever think about stopping, about just relaxing and letting me handle everything?" I looked at him and said, "Son, one day soon I'll have to, but not today. Today I want to see the kitchen again." He hesitated, but then nodded and said, "All right, Mom, but only for a little while." We drove to the kitchen together. The sun was rising behind the hills, casting a soft golden light over the town. When we arrived, I could hear laughter even from the street. The smell of bread and soup filled the air, and I felt tears gather in my eyes. Inside, people greeted me with hugs and smiles. The tables were full, the volunteers moving like a family working in harmony. I watched Jacob step behind the counter to serve a man who looked tired and hungry. He placed the bowl gently in front of him and said, "Here, friend, eat this. It's made with love." In that moment, I saw everything I had ever prayed for: a son who had learned to give, a community that had learned to love, and a world that had chosen kindness over judgment. I whispered, "Thank you, God, for letting me see this." Later that day, I sat at my favorite table near the window. A little girl with curly hair ran up to me and said, "Miss Martha, can I sit with you?" I smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart." She sat and said, "My mommy says you made this place because your heart is magic." I chuckled and said, "No, dear, my heart isn't magic. It just learned how to keep loving even when it hurt." The girl grinned and said, "That's kind of like magic to me." She ran back to her mom and I sat there watching her go, my heart full and quiet. As the day ended, I felt a gentle tiredness, the kind that comes not from work, but from peace. I asked Jacob to take me home that evening. I sat on the porch wrapped in my shawl, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. The wind whispered through the trees and I could almost hear Michael's laughter carried softly in the breeze. Jacob sat beside me quietly. Then he said, "Mom, I've been thinking maybe we should rename the kitchen after you. People should know who built it." I smiled and shook my head. No, son, the kitchen doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who ever needed love. That's what makes it sacred. He looked down and nodded, wiping a tear. The next morning I didn't wake up. The nurse said I went peacefully in my sleep. The sun had just begun to rise, and the first light of dawn touched the room with warmth. At my funeral, the whole town came. People brought flowers, homemade bread, and stories. They talked about my laugh, about my hugs, about how I always said love never ends. Jacob stood before everyone, his voice trembling as he read a letter I had left him. He said, "My mother taught me that forgiveness is the hardest kind of courage and kindness is the most powerful kind of strength. She believed that even a simple bowl of soup could change a life if it was made with love, and she was right." After the service, they returned to the kitchen. The volunteers lit candles and placed them on every table in the corner. A framed photo of me stood beside a pot of fresh soup. The sign above the door still read Michael's table. That night, Jacob served the first bowl of soup in my home. Nor he tasted it, smiled through tears, and whispered softly, "Just enough salt, Mom, just enough love." Years passed, but the kitchen never closed. More people came, new volunteers joined, and the story of Martha Turner spread far beyond the little town schools, taught children about her courage. Churches spoke of her faith, and strangers across the country started small kitchens in her name. Sometimes when the lights flicker late at night in Michael's table, the volunteers say they feel a warm breeze and the faint smell of cinnamon and soup. They smile and say, "Miss Martha must be watching over us again." And maybe I am, because love never really leaves. It just finds new hearts to live in. So if you ever walk into a place that smells of soup and kindness, and you hear laughter and see people being fed with joy, remember this story. Remember that even the smallest act of love can change everything, because that's how I began too, with a simple bowl of soup and a heart that refused to stop loving. The end.